There's a photograph that circulates occasionally on the internet, usually without much context, showing the Shanghai skyline at night. Towers of glass and steel pierce the darkness. Neon advertisements pulse with the energy of global capital. Luxury brands compete for attention on every surface. It looks like any other monument to modern capitalism: Hong Kong, New York, Dubai. But if you look closely at the street level, among the Ferrari dealerships and Michelin-starred restaurants, you'll notice something peculiar. Red flags, emblazoned with hammers and sickles, Communist Party slogans, painted on buildings, housing investment banks. This isn't Photoshop or irony. This is the visual representation of what might be the most successful political experiment of the last 50 years, and arguably one of the most intellectually incoherent systems ever devised. Welcome to the paradox of Chinese capitalist communism, a hybrid that by all traditional political theory should have collapsed decades ago, yet instead has lifted more human beings out of poverty than any other system in recorded history, while maintaining one-party authoritarian rule. The question isn't whether this makes sense. It doesn't, not by any conventional framework. The question is how it works, why it emerged, and whether it can possibly last. To understand how China built this seemingly impossible system, we need to start not with economics or ideology, but with trauma. The Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949 didn't happen in a vacuum. It emerged from what Chinese historians still call the Century of Humiliation, a period stretching from the First Opium War in 1839 through the Japanese occupation, ending in 1945. Imagine living in a civilization that for millennia had considered itself the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, only to watch foreign powers carve it into spheres of influence, like a cake at a birthday party you weren't invited to. British merchants forcing opium addiction on your population to balance trade deficits. Western troops ransacking the Summer Palace, unequal treaties that granted foreigners immunity from Chinese law on Chinese soil. Japanese armies conducting experiments on live prisoners in Manchuria. This wasn't just military defeat, it was a comprehensive assault on national dignity that killed tens of millions and shattered every assumption the Chinese elite had held about their civilization's superiority. When Mao Zedong stood at Tiananmen Square in October 1949 and declared that the Chinese people have stood up, he was speaking to this wound. The revolution wasn't simply about implementing Marx and Lenin's theories about class, struggle, and proletarian dictatorship. It was about reclaiming sovereignty, about ensuring that never again would foreign powers dictate terms to China. This psychological dimension helps explain why Chinese communism took the particular shape it did under Mao. The Soviet Union had adopted communism from a position of relative strength, emerging victorious from the Russian Civil War and World War II. China adopted it from a position of profound weakness and humiliation. The difference matters enormously. Mao looked to the Soviet model because it seemed to offer a path to rapid industrialization and military strength, the very things China lacked: central planning, collectivization of agriculture, elimination of private property, the whole apparatus of command economics. But where the Soviets were industrializing an already partially industrialized economy, China in 1949 was overwhelmingly agrarian. 80% of the population were peasants. The industrial base was minimal. Infrastructure had been destroyed by decades of warfare. So when Mao launched the Great Leap Forward in 1958, attempting to catapult China into industrial modernity through sheer revolutionary willpower, he was essentially asking a nation of farmers to build steel mills in their backyards and meet production quotas divorced from any economic reality. The human cost of this ideological experiment defies comprehension. The Great Leap Forward famine killed somewhere between 15 and 45 million people. The exact number remains disputed because the catastrophe was so complete that reliable records don't exist. Think about that uncertainty for a moment. We're not sure whether it was 15 million or 45 million deaths. That's a margin of error larger than the entire population of many countries. People ate tree bark, grass, dirt. Reports emerged of cannibalism in rural areas. Yet because Mao's cult of personality had reached such heights, and because the structure of the communist system punished bearers of bad news, local officials continued to report grain production quotas being met even as their populations starved. The state, believing its own false statistics, continued to extract grain from areas experiencing famine to meet export commitments and urban consumption needs. It was a feedback loop of ideological blindness, political fear, and institutional dysfunction that turned policy error into one of history's greatest peacetime catastrophes. If the Great Leap Forward was economic madness, the Cultural Revolution that followed from 1966 to 1976 was social madness. Mao, feeling his grip on power slipping and concerned about bureaucratic ossification in the party, essentially unleashed China's youth to attack the Communist Party's own institutions in the name of ideological purity. Schools closed for years. Intellectuals were sent to labor camps for re-education. Ancient temples were destroyed by Red Guards, seeking to eliminate the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. Families were torn apart as children denounced parents for ideological deviation. The economy stagnated. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was poorer than India. Average life expectancy was rising due to basic public health measures, but in terms of GDP per capita, technological development, and living standards, the great communist experiment had manifestly failed to deliver prosperity. Here's where human psychology becomes crucial to understanding what happened next. The Chinese Communist Party faced an existential crisis after Mao's death. Its claim to legitimacy rested on Marxist-Leninist ideology and the promise of building a workers' paradise. But 30 years of communist rule had produced poverty, chaos, and mass death. In a democracy, the ruling party would simply lose the next election. In an authoritarian system, the options are more limited: revolution from below, military coup, or somehow reinventing yourself while maintaining power. The party chose the third option, and the man who engineered this reinvention was Deng Xiaoping, a pragmatist who had been purged twice during the Cultural Revolution and apparently learned that ideological purity was a luxury. Deng's genius, if we can call it that, was recognizing that the party didn't need to choose between maintaining power and improving people's lives. It needed to do both, and ideology would have to bend to accommodate this reality. His famous statement that it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice became the philosophical foundation for what would be called socialism with Chinese characteristics, a phrase so elastic it could justify almost any policy. Want to allow private farming? It's socialism with Chinese characteristics. Want to create special economic zones where foreign capitalists can set up factories? Still socialism with Chinese characteristics. Want stock markets and billionaires? You guessed, its Chinese characteristics make it compatible with socialism. This semantic flexibility might seem cynical, and in some ways it was, but it also reflected something deeper about Chinese political culture. China had a long history of adapting foreign ideas to local conditions. Buddhism, arriving from India in the 1st century CE, was thoroughly Sinicized over the following centuries, merged with Confucian and Taoist elements to create something distinctly Chinese. The same pattern held for Soviet-style communism: imported, then adapted, then transformed into something its originators wouldn't recognize. Deng was essentially arguing that the form of economic organization mattered less than the outcomes it produced, and that the Communist Party's legitimacy would come not from ideological correctness, but from delivering prosperity and national strength. The reforms began cautiously in the late 1970s with agriculture. The household responsibility system allowed farmers to sell surplus production on the market after meeting state quotas. It was a de facto return to private farming, though officially described as a form of collective ownership. The response was immediate and dramatic. Agricultural productivity surged. Peasants, responding to the oldest economic incentive in the world, being able to keep what you produce, worked harder and smarter. Within a few years, China solved its food security crisis. This created political breathing room for more radical reforms in the industrial sector. In 1980, Deng established special economic zones in coastal areas, most famously Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong. These were essentially capitalist laboratories where foreign investment was welcomed, private enterprise encouraged, and market mechanisms allowed to function with minimal state interference. The gamble was that these zones could generate growth and learn lessons about market economics without corrupting the socialist system in the rest of the country. Shenzhen transformed from a fishing village of 30,000 people into a metropolis of millions within 2 decades. The experiment worked beyond anyone's expectations. But here's what made China's approach different from other post-communist reforms. When the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries began their transitions in the late 1980s and early 1990s, They adopted what economists called shock therapy: rapid privatization, sudden price liberalization, wholesale dismantling of the planned economy. The results were often catastrophic. In the short term, GDP collapsed, savings were wiped out by hyperinflation. Life expectancy actually declined in Russia during the 1990s. China instead pursued what Deng called crossing the river by feeling the stones: gradual, experimental, reversible reforms that could be scaled up if successful, or abandoned if they failed. This incrementalism reflected not Western-style democratic deliberation, but rather the extreme risk aversion of a ruling party that had seen what revolutionary fervor could produce and had no intention of losing control again. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most astonishing economic stories of our time: China's transformation. How did a nation facing widespread poverty just a few decades ago become the world's second-largest economy? It's a complex and fascinating journey, so let's unpack it. Let's rewind to the late 1970s. China's economy was centrally planned, largely agrarian, and isolated from the global market. The vast majority of its population lived in rural poverty. But in 1978, a pivotal moment occurred. Under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, China embarked on a new path called reform and opening up. This wasn't just a small policy tweak. It was a fundamental shift in economic philosophy. The first major changes happened in the countryside. The government dismantled the old commune system and introduced the household responsibility system. This was a game changer. For the first time in decades, farmers could manage their own land and sell their surplus produce on the open market. This simple incentive unleashed a wave of productivity. Agricultural outputs soared, incomes rose, and millions were lifted out of poverty. It was the first crucial step in unlocking the nation's economic potential. With agriculture revitalized, the reforms moved to the cities. The focus shifted to industrialization. China established special economic zones, or SEZs, in coastal areas like Shenzhen. Think of these zones as giant laboratories for capitalism. They offered foreign companies tax breaks, streamlined regulations, and access to a massive labor force. The idea was to attract foreign investment, technology, and management expertise. And it worked spectacularly. Companies from all over the world flocked to these zones, setting up factories to produce everything from textiles and toys to electronics. This created millions of manufacturing jobs, sparking the largest migration in human history as people moved from rural villages to booming coastal cities in search of work. Shenzhen, once a small fishing village, transformed into a sprawling metropolis, a symbol of China's rapid urbanization and industrial might. This export-oriented model, often called the world's factory, became the engine of China's growth for many years. Of course, this rapid industrialization came at a cost. We can't talk about this era without acknowledging the environmental challenges. Smog, water pollution, and land degradation became serious issues as factories multiplied. The government has since recognized these problems and is now investing heavily in green technology and sustainable development, but it's an ongoing battle. There were social challenges too, with a growing gap between the rich coastal cities and the poorer inland regions, and concerns over labor conditions in the early factory boom. As the 90s and 2000s rolled on, the reforms deepened. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, a landmark event that fully integrated it into the global economy. This move lowered trade barriers, boosted exports even further, and forced Chinese companies to become more competitive on the world stage. State-owned enterprises, which once dominated the economy, were restructured, and the private sector was given more room to grow. This period saw the rise of domestic corporate giants in various sectors. Then came the internet. The digital revolution swept across China, but with a unique twist. While Western tech giants were largely blocked, a vibrant domestic ecosystem flourished. Companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu emerged, creating their own versions of e-commerce platforms, social media apps, and search engines. Today, China is a leader in mobile payments, with almost everyone using apps like WeChat Pay and Alipay for daily transactions. This digital transformation has created a massive new sector of the economy and changed the way hundreds of millions of people live, shop, and communicate. So, where is China's economy headed now? The old model of low-cost manufacturing and exports is no longer enough. The government is now actively pursuing a new strategy, focusing on high-tech innovation, domestic consumption, and services. They call it dual circulation. The goal is to become a world leader in fields like artificial intelligence, 5G, electric vehicles, and biotechnology. Initiatives like Made in China 2025 are all about moving up the value chain, from assembling products to designing and creating them. At the same time, China is working to boost its domestic market. With a growing middle class of over 400 million people, there's a huge potential consumer base. The government wants people to spend more, relying less on exports and more on internal demand to drive growth. This shift is crucial for creating a more resilient and sustainable economy in the long run. China's economic story is far from over. It faces significant challenges ahead, including an aging population, high debt levels, and ongoing trade tensions. Navigating these issues will require another round of smart reforms and careful planning. But the transformation from 1978 to today is truly one for the history books. It's a story of pragmatism, ambition, and the incredible dynamism of its people. It's a reminder that with the right policies and a willingness to adapt, profound change is possible. What do you think is the most impressive part of China's economic journey? What challenges do you see for its future? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks so much for watching, and if you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. See you in the next one. Environmental degradation accompanied rapid growth. Air quality in major cities became hazardous. Rivers turned toxic. Farmland was contaminated with heavy metals. The costs of growth were externalized onto the environment and public health in ways that would have been politically impossible in democracies with free media and environmental movements. But the party calculated, probably correctly, that most people would accept pollution in exchange for prosperity, at least initially. Only later, as the middle class became secure enough to care about quality of life beyond material consumption, did environmental concerns gain political traction. Cultural transformations were equally profound. The revolutionary collectivism of the Mao era gave way to hyper-competitive individualism. The sardonic phrase, "get rich is glorious," attributed to Deng, though he may never have said it exactly that way, captured the shift perfectly. Money became the measure of success in a society that had once claimed to abolish class distinctions. Conspicuous consumption, status competition, materialistic values, all the features of capitalism that Marxists had criticized flourished in communist China. The ideological contradiction was obvious to everyone, but it was papered over with the elastic phrase socialism, with Chinese characteristics and the tangible reality of improving living standards. For the Communist Party itself, this created a legitimacy challenge that intensified over time. How do you maintain a communist identity while presiding over wealth inequality, stock markets, and billionaires? How do you justify one-party rule when Marxist theory suggests that the state should be withering away as communism approaches? The answer was to supplement ideological legitimacy with performance. Legitimacy: we deserve to rule not because of communist theory, but because we deliver results, and with nationalist legitimacy, we deserve to rule because we're restoring China to its rightful place as a great power. The shift toward nationalism became increasingly pronounced over time, with the party portraying itself as the defender of Chinese civilization against foreign pressure and the architect of national rejuvenation. By 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power, the system had been operating along these lines for 2 decades. It had delivered extraordinary growth and survived the global financial crisis better than most Western economies. But the contradictions were intensifying. Debt levels were rising alarmingly, particularly in local government financing vehicles and state-owned enterprises. The real estate bubble had inflated to dangerous proportions, with housing prices in major cities reaching multiples of annual income that made affordability crises in London or San Francisco look mild. Corruption had become endemic, with officials at all levels extracting rents from the system they controlled. The gap between rich and poor had widened to the point where it threatened social stability, and the growth model based on exports and investment was running into diminishing returns. You can only build so many apartment blocks and high-speed rail lines before the marginal return falls below the cost of capital. Xi's response has been to re-centralize power and reassert party control in ways that mark a departure from the relative pluralism of the previous decades. The anti-corruption campaign that began in 2013 was real in the sense that it did punish corrupt officials. But it was also a purge mechanism that eliminated Xi's rivals and consolidated his personal authority. The removal of term limits in 2018, allowing Xi to remain in power indefinitely, ended the succession system that had created some predictability and constraint on individual leaders. The crackdown on tech companies like Alibaba and Didi in 2021 sent a clear message that no economic actor, however powerful, could challenge party authority. The rhetoric around common prosperity marked a shift from letting some get rich first toward greater emphasis on redistribution and shared wealth. Whether this represents a genuine return to more orthodox communist principles or simply power consolidation dressed in ideological language remains debated. What's clear is that she has tilted the balance back toward political control and away from economic autonomy. The private sector, which had been the engine of growth and innovation, now operates under greater uncertainty about the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Foreign companies face more restrictions and pressure to transfer technology. The surveillance state has expanded enormously with facial recognition, social credit systems, and pervasive monitoring that would have been technologically impossible a generation ago, but now represents the frontier of authoritarian control. Meanwhile, the economic challenges that motivated this recentralization haven't disappeared. China's demographics are among the worst in the world, with a rapidly aging population and shrinking workforce. The one-child policy maintained from 1980 to 2015 created a demographic time bomb that's now exploding. The working-age population peaked around 2015 and is now declining. The old-age dependency ratio, the number of elderly per working-age adult, is rising fast. This means slower growth, pressure on pension systems, and less flexibility for economic experimentation. Countries typically get rich before they get old. China is at risk of getting old before it gets rich. Trapped in what economists call the middle-income trap, where labor is too expensive to compete on cost, but productivity isn't high enough to compete on innovation. The property bubble has begun deflating, with major developers like Evergrande defaulting on debts. The local government financing vehicles that funded infrastructure are over-leveraged and struggling to repay bondholders. The banking system is riddled with non-performing loans that are masked by accounting conventions but represent real economic losses, and the external environment has become more hostile, with the United States and its allies pursuing various forms of decoupling, restricting technology transfers, and reshoring supply chains. The geopolitical confrontation over Taiwan creates an ever-present risk of military conflict that could devastate the economy overnight. The younger generation shows signs of disillusionment that would have been unthinkable during the high-growth decades. The lying flat movement, where young people reject the 996 work culture, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, and embrace minimalist lifestyles, represents a quiet rebellion against the hyper-competitive rat race. Youth unemployment has reached concerning levels, partly because the economy isn't generating enough high-quality jobs for the expanding cohort of university graduates. When the party cracked down on private tutoring companies in 2021, ostensibly to reduce pressure on students and families, it destroyed an industry overnight and put millions out of work. These contradictions between the promise of prosperity through hard work and the reality of constrained opportunities create social tensions that economic growth had previously papered over. So, what exactly is this system? It's clearly not transitioning to democracy, as many Western theorists predicted. The idea that economic development inevitably leads to political liberalization, so confident in the 1990s, has been falsified by China's trajectory. It's not traditional communism. The market is too central, private property too entrenched, wealth inequality too extreme. It's not fascism. Despite some superficial similarities in nationalism and corporatist organization, because it lacks the revolutionary dynamism and cult of violence that characterized European fascism. It's something distinct, a hybrid that combines a Leninist party structure, maintaining political monopoly, a market economy with strategic state control, nationalism, supplementing ideology as a legitimacy. Source: technocratic meritocracy in the bureaucracy, and adaptive authoritarianism that learns and evolves, rather than rigidly adhering to doctrine. This model emerged specifically from China's circumstances. Its size, which makes administrative control challenging, but also creates a massive internal market. Its history, which created both trauma from foreign domination and traditions of centralized governance. Its culture, which emphasizes hierarchy, collective identity, and pragmatism over abstract principles. And its geopolitical position, which allowed it to integrate into the global economy while maintaining political sovereignty. Whether this model can be exported to other countries remains questionable. Vietnam has followed a similar path with some success. Singapore offers another example of authoritarian developmental state, though on a much smaller scale. But attempts by other countries to import Chinese-style development often stumble because they lack the state capacity, cultural foundations, or geopolitical conditions that China possessed. The fundamental question is whether this hybrid system is stable or inherently unstable. There are arguments on both sides. The pessimistic view says that the contradictions will intensify until something breaks. You cannot indefinitely maintain Communist Party legitimacy while managing capitalist contradictions. Economic development creates an educated middle class with rising expectations for political voice, environmental quality, rule of law, and individual rights. History suggests this tension eventually resolves toward liberalization. Look at South Korea, Taiwan, and other developmental states that eventually democratized. The surveillance state can suppress dissent, but it cannot eliminate the underlying desires for autonomy and dignity. The economic model faces diminishing returns, and without political reform to address corruption, misallocation of capital, and accountability deficits, growth will slow to the point where the performance legitimacy evaporates. The optimistic view, at least from the party's perspective, argues that the system has proven remarkably resilient and adaptive. It has survived the Tiananmen crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, trade wars, and a pandemic. Each time, predictions of imminent collapse proved wrong. The party has shown capacity to learn from mistakes, to adjust policies when necessary, to coop potential opposition, and to use both carrots and sticks to maintain stability. The notion that democracy is the only stable end state for developed countries may simply reflect Western bias rather than universal truth. Perhaps China is pioneering a new model market authoritarianism, or technocratic one-party rule, that proves viable for countries that prioritize collective welfare and national strength over individual liberty and competitive elections. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The system is neither doomed to imminent collapse nor guaranteed perpetual stability. It will continue to evolve, probably in ways that surprise both its critics and defenders. The contradictions are real between communist ideology and capitalist practice, between economic dynamism and political control, between nationalist legitimacy and the need for international cooperation. But contradictions don't necessarily produce collapse. They can also drive adaptation and synthesis. After all, the entire history of China's hybrid system has been a process of managing contradictions that theoretically should be manageable. What this means for the global order is profound and uncertain. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, there's a genuine alternative model to liberal democratic capitalism that appears to work at least by the metric of economic growth and state capacity. This creates both competition and possibility. Competition, because China's success challenges Western assumptions about the relationship between freedom and prosperity, potentially making authoritarianism more attractive to developing countries. Possibility, because the existence of different systems creates opportunities for learning and adaptation, for seeing which approaches work better for which challenges. The insanity of China's hybrid political system, when viewed through the lens of traditional political theory, is also its genius. By refusing to be bound by ideological orthodoxy, by treating political economy as an engineering problem rather than a theological one, by prioritizing outcomes over doctrinal purity, China's leadership created space for experimentation that more ideologically consistent systems couldn't match. The willingness to call capitalism socialism with Chinese characteristics might seem like Orwellian doublespeak, and in some ways it is, but it also reflects a deeply pragmatic recognition that labels matter less than results. That governing a continent-sized country of 1.4 billion people requires flexibility rather than rigidity. Yet pragmatism has its limits. At some point, the gap between rhetoric and reality becomes unsustainable. Can you really maintain a Communist Party-esque claim to ideological leadership when the country has more billionaires than anywhere except the United States? Can you sustain legitimacy through economic growth when demographics and debt make high growth impossible? Can you keep an educated, cosmopolitan population politically docile through a combination of prosperity, nationalism, and surveillance indefinitely? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're genuine uncertainties about which intelligent observers disagree. If you return to that photograph of Shanghai's skyline, the one with neon capitalism overseen by communist symbols, you see the paradox crystallized in a single image. It's a system that shouldn't work but does, that violates every theoretical model but produces results, that combines elements normally considered incompatible into something functional, if not always coherent. Whether this represents the future of governance or merely a transitional phase in China's longer trajectory remains to be seen. What is certain is that the lazy assumption that all countries must converge on Western-style liberal democracy has been decisively challenged. China has written a different script, and the final act hasn't been performed yet. The question now is whether this script leads to a new equilibrium, a sustainable alternative to democracy, or whether the contradictions that have been managed for decades will finally demand resolution. Either way, understanding how China built this insane hybrid system isn't just an academic exercise in comparative politics. It's essential for comprehending the world we actually live in rather than the one our theories predicted we should inhabit.